The bullet meant for Rebecca Jane would have torn through her heart if the mountain man hadn't thrown himself between her and the gun, taking the shot in his shoulder instead. And that was the moment she understood that some men were born to protect, even when it meant their own blood would spill. It was 1876, and Grass Valley, California, had seen its share of violence during the gold rush years, but by now the town had settled into something resembling civilization. Rebecca Jane Morris had arrived 3 weeks earlier on the stagecoach from San Francisco, her entire life packed into 2 worn carpet bags and a leather satchel that held her mother's Bible. She was 22 years old, unmarried, and entirely alone in the world after her father's debts had consumed everything they owned. The boarding house where she'd taken a room smelled of lye soap and boiled cabbage, and the other women who lived there whispered about her behind their hands because she didn't lower her eyes when men looked at her on the street. The general store needed help, and Rebecca had neat handwriting and could cipher better than most men. Mr. Griswold hired her on the spot, though his wife made it clear she thought it unseemly for a woman to work alongside customers who might be rough miners or drifters. Rebecca didn't care what Mrs. Griswold thought. She needed to eat, and she'd learned long ago that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. She first saw Orion Luther on a Tuesday morning when the September sun was already beating down hard enough to make the wooden sidewalks steam from the previous night's rain. He came into the store with the kind of presence that made conversations stop mid-sentence. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly blocked the doorway. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, tied back with a leather cord that had seen better days. His arms, visible beneath his rolled-up sleeves, were corded with muscle that spoke of years spent doing hard physical labor in unforgiving terrain. His face was weathered and tanned, with a strong jaw covered in several days' worth of dark stubble, and his eyes were the color of mountain stone, gray and steady and impossible to read. Rebecca had been restocking the shelf of canned goods when he entered, and she felt his presence before she saw him. The air seemed to shift, to become heavier somehow. When she turned and their eyes met, something passed between them that she couldn't name. It felt like recognition, though they'd never met before. It felt like inevitability. "Help you?" she asked, keeping her voice level and professional despite the strange flutter in her chest. He studied her for a long moment, and she refused to look away. Most men in Grass Valley either ignored her completely or stared at her with open speculation about whether she was respectable. Orion Luther did neither. He looked at her like she was a puzzle he wanted to understand. "Need supplies," he said finally. His voice was deep and rough, like he didn't use it often. "Flour, salt, coffee, ammunition for a Winchester." Rebecca nodded and moved to gather his items. She could feel him watching her as she worked, but it didn't feel threatening or presumptuous. It felt careful, almost reverent. "You're new in town," he said. It wasn't a question. 3 weeks, she replied, wrapping the flour in brown paper with efficient movements. "You're not." The corner of his mouth twitched slightly. "Been in these mountains 8 years, come down to Grass Valley maybe once a month for supplies. You live up there alone?" She shouldn't have asked. It was too personal, too forward. But something about him made her want to know. "Got a cabin about 15 miles north, near the high country. Built it myself." He paused, then added, "Name's Orion Luther. Rebecca Jane Morris." She set his supplies on the counter and tallied up the cost. "That'll be $3.40. He paid in coins that he counted out slowly, his hands large and calloused but surprisingly careful. When his fingers accidentally brushed hers as he handed over the last quarter, she felt heat spread up her arm like wildfire. "Rebecca Jane," he said softly, testing her name on his tongue. The way he said it made something deep in her chest tighten. Nobody had ever said her name quite like that before, with such careful attention to each syllable, like it mattered. She swallowed hard. "Yes? It's a good name." He gathered his supplies and tipped his hat to her slightly. "I'll be seeing you, Miss Morris." He was gone before she could respond, the door closing behind him with a soft chime of the bell. Rebecca stood there for a long moment, staring at the space he'd occupied, trying to understand what had just happened. Her hands were trembling slightly, and she pressed them flat against the counter to steady herself. Mrs. Griswold emerged from the back room with her perpetual expression of disapproval firmly in place. "That was Orion Luther, mountain man. Keeps to himself mostly, which is probably for the best. A woman like you should stay clear of men like that." Rebecca didn't ask what Mrs. Griswold meant by "a woman like you" or "men like that." She had a feeling she wouldn't like the answer either way, but she couldn't stop thinking about him. That night, lying in her narrow bed in the boarding house, she replayed their conversation over and over. She thought about his gray eyes and the way he'd said her name like it was something precious. She thought about his massive shoulders and the careful way he'd counted out his coins, and she wondered what kind of life a man lived alone in the mountains for 8 years. She didn't expect to see him again for weeks, given what he'd said about his monthly trips to town. But he came back 3 days later. This time, she was alone in the store. Mr. Griswold had gone to Sacramento for a meeting with his supplier, and Mrs. Griswold was at home with a headache that Rebecca suspected was more convenient than genuine. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, making dust motes dance in the golden light. The bell chimed, and she looked up from the ledger she'd been updating to find Orion standing in the doorway again, hat in his hands. "Mr. Luther," she said, surprised, "did you forget something?" He shook his head slowly, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "No, madam, I just—" He trailed off, seeming uncertain, which was somehow endearing on such a large, capable-looking man. "I wanted to see you again." Her heart kicked hard against her ribs. "Oh. If that's too forward, I apologize. I can leave." But he didn't move toward the door. Rebecca set down her pen carefully, buying herself time to think. Every practical instinct she possessed told her to be cautious. She knew nothing about this man except that he lived alone in the mountains and made Mrs. Griswold purse her lips in disapproval. But something deeper than instinct, something that felt like truth, told her that Orion Luther wasn't dangerous, at least not to her. "It's forward," she agreed, "but I don't mind." His shoulders relaxed slightly. "I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since Tuesday." She should have been shocked by such a bold admission. Instead, she found herself smiling. "I've been thinking about you too." He took a step closer, then another, until he was standing on the other side of the counter. This close, she could smell pine and leather and something uniquely him. "I'm not good with words, Miss Morris. Haven't had much practice talking to people, let alone a woman like you. But I'd like to court you proper, if you'd allow it." "You don't know anything about me," she said softly. "I know you're not afraid to work. I know you look people in the eye. I know your hands shake a little when you wrap packages, like you're nervous but trying not to show it. I know you're brave enough to come to a town where you don't know a soul and start over." His gray eyes held hers steadily. "I'd like to know more." Rebecca's throat felt tight. "I'm not from a good family, Mr. Luther. My father died owing money all over San Francisco. I'm here because I had nowhere else to go." "Don't care about your father's debts," Orion said simply. "I'm asking about you. I'm 22 years old and I've never been courted before, not properly." The admission felt vulnerable, but she owed him honesty if he was offering the same. "Men in San Francisco looked at me like I was something to be used and discarded. I won't be treated that way." "Wouldn't dream of it," he said, and the conviction in his voice made her believe him. "Rebecca Jane, I'm asking if I can come calling on you. Take you to dinner at the hotel, maybe go for a walk on Sunday after church. Get to know you the right way." She realized she was holding her breath. "Yes, I'd like that." The smile that spread across his face transformed him completely. He looked younger, less weathered, almost boyish despite his size and obvious strength. "Sunday, then? I'll come by the boarding house at noon." "Sunday at noon," she agreed. He started to turn toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. "Rebecca Jane," he said again, and just like before, the way he spoke her name made her feel like something rare and valuable. "I'm glad you came to Grass Valley." After he left, Rebecca sat down behind the counter because her legs felt too unsteady to hold her. Her heart was racing, and her face felt hot. She pressed her cool palms against her cheeks and took a deep breath, then another. She was being reckless. She was being foolish. She barely knew this man. But God help her. She wanted to know him. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a crisp breeze that carried the scent of pine down from the mountains. Rebecca wore her best dress, a dark blue cotton with white trim at the collar and cuffs. It was several years old and had been mended more than once, but it was clean and pressed, and it made her eyes look brighter. She'd spent extra time on her hair, coiling it into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, with just a few soft tendrils framing her face. The other women at the boarding house watched her with undisguised curiosity as she waited in the parlor. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the establishment, had given her a long lecture about propriety and reputation, which Rebecca had endured with as much patience as she could muster. Finally, at precisely noon, there was a knock at the door. Orion had cleaned up too. His hair was still long, but it was neatly combed and tied back. He wore a clean shirt and vest, and his boots were polished. But it was impossible to make him look civilized in any conventional sense. He was too big, too rugged, too obviously built for wild spaces rather than parlors and tea services. Rebecca thought he looked magnificent. "Miss Morris," he said formally, very aware of Mrs. Henderson's watchful eyes. "You look beautiful." "Thank you, Mr. Luther. You look very handsome." They walked to the hotel restaurant, and Rebecca was hyper-aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Orion Luther was known in Grass Valley, but he was an outsider, someone who chose mountains over community. And Rebecca was new enough that people were still deciding what to make of her. Together, they made quite the spectacle, but Orion seemed oblivious to the attention, and his calm helped settle her nerves. He held doors for her, pulled out her chair, and spoke to her with the same careful attention he'd shown in the store. Over roast chicken and potatoes, she learned that he was 28 years old, originally from Missouri, and had come west after the war. He'd tried mining at first, but found he couldn't stomach being underground. "Felt like being buried alive," he explained, his expression troubled at the memory. "But I loved the mountains, loved the quiet and the space. So I learned to trap, learned to hunt, learned to live up there. Built my cabin by a creek where I can hear the water running all night long." "Don't you get lonely?" Rebecca asked. He considered the question seriously. "Used to think I didn't. Got used to my own company, told myself I preferred it, but now—" He looked at her with those steady gray eyes. "Now I think maybe I was just waiting." Her breath caught. "Waiting for what?" "For you." He said it simply, like it was a fact as basic as the sun rising. "I know that sounds like fancy talk, but it's the truth. Minute I saw you in that store, I knew something had changed, like I'd been walking around only half awake and suddenly I wasn't anymore." Rebecca set down her fork carefully. Her hands were shaking again. "I feel it too," she whispered. "It doesn't make sense. We barely know each other." "Then let's fix that." He reached across the table, palm up, an invitation. After only a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong and gentle. "Tell me about San Francisco. Tell me about your life before you came here." So she did. She told him about growing up as an only child, about her mother dying when she was 14, and her father slowly drinking himself into debt and an early grave. She told him about the boarding house where she'd worked to help pay their rent, about learning to keep ledgers because numbers made sense when nothing else did. She told him about the men who'd made assumptions about a girl who worked in a boarding house, and the sick feeling she'd carried in her stomach every day, knowing that one wrong step could destroy what little reputation she had. After Papa died, the creditors took everything. The landlord gave me 3 days to clear out. I had barely enough money for a stagecoach ticket, so I picked Grass Valley because I'd heard they needed workers and the gold rush was over, so maybe it would be safer. She looked down at their joined hands. "I was terrified the whole way here." "You're the bravest person I've ever met," Orion said quietly. She laughed, a short, sharp sound. "I'm not brave. I was just out of options." "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what needs doing anyway." His thumb stroked over her knuckles. "You could have given up, could have made choices that would have destroyed you. But you didn't. You came here and you started over. And that takes courage." Tears burned behind her eyes, but she blinked them away. She wasn't used to being praised, wasn't used to being seen as anything other than a problem to be solved or an opportunity to be exploited. "Tell me more about your cabin," she said, needing to change the subject before she embarrassed herself by crying in the middle of the hotel restaurant. His face softened. "It's not fancy. One room with a loft where I sleep. I built the furniture myself, and it's rough work, but it's solid. Got a stone fireplace that I made with rocks from the creek. In the morning, the sun comes through the east window and lights up the whole space. There's a clearing in front where deer come to graze at dawn, and behind the cabin, the forest goes up into high country where you can see for miles. It sounds beautiful, she said honestly. It is. But it's lonely too, like you said. I didn't mind that before, but I mind it now. Now I keep thinking how it would look with you there, how much better everything would be if I could share it with you. Mr. Luther, she started, but he shook his head. Orion. Please, just Orion when we're alone like this. Orion, she said, testing his name the way he'd tested hers. This is moving very fast. I know. If that scares you, I'll slow down. But I won't lie to you about what I'm feeling. He squeezed her hand gently. I've lived by myself for 8 years. I've gotten used to saying exactly what I mean because there's nobody around to hear it anyway. So I'll tell you straight. I think I could fall in love with you, Rebecca Jane. Think maybe I already have. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. I don't know how to do this. I've never had anyone look at me the way you do. How do I look at you? Like I'm worth something. Like I matter. His expression turned fierce. You do matter. You matter more than anything. They stayed at the restaurant until the sun started to sink toward the western hills, talking about everything and nothing. She learned that he liked strong coffee and had a sweet tooth he rarely indulged because sugar was expensive. He learned that she could read Latin and had once dreamed of being a teacher before her father's debts made that impossible. She learned that he'd carved a chess set from pine wood during his first winter in the mountains and still played against himself on quiet evenings. He learned that she was afraid of thunderstorms and loved the smell of rain. When he finally walked her back to the boarding house, the evening was settling in with that particular gold-purple light that made everything look touched by magic. They stood on the porch, and Rebecca realized she didn't want the day to end. Can I see you again? Orion asked. Next Sunday? What about before then? You said you come to town once a month, but you've been here 3 times in the last week. He had the grace to look slightly sheepish. Made excuses to come back. Told myself I needed more ammunition, then more coffee. Truth is, I just wanted to see you. The store is closed on Sundays, but I work Monday through Saturday, she said. If you happen to need supplies during the week, I'd be there. I'll definitely need supplies, he said, and there was warmth in his voice that made her smile. And Sunday, she added. I'd like to see you again on Sunday. Every Sunday, he said firmly, and as many days in between as you'll allow. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, and the gesture was so old-fashioned and courtly that it made her throat tight again. Then he was gone, walking down the darkening street with his long stride, and Rebecca stood on the porch watching him until he disappeared around the corner. Mrs. Henderson was waiting inside with her arms crossed and her mouth set in a thin line. That man has a reputation, Miss Morris. What kind of reputation? Rebecca asked, though she was tired of other people's opinions. He shot 2 men 6 years back, killed them both. Rebecca's stomach clenched, but she kept her voice steady. Why? Does it matter why? A man who can kill, yes, it matters why. Rebecca met Mrs. Henderson's eyes directly. If he murdered them in cold blood, that's one thing. If he had a reason, that's another. Mrs. Henderson sniffed. They were trying to steal his furs from what I heard. He warned them off and they came back with guns. Sheriff said it was self-defense. But still, a man like that has violence in him. Everyone has violence in them, Rebecca said quietly. The question is whether they use it to hurt the innocent or to protect what's theirs. Thank you for the information, Mrs. Henderson. I'll take it into consideration. She went upstairs before the older woman could respond, but she couldn't sleep that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Orion Luther and his gray eyes and the way he'd said she mattered, thinking about the fact that he'd killed 2 men and wondering what that meant about him. But she also thought about the gentleness with which he'd held her hand, the careful way he spoke to her, the respect he showed her even when they were alone, the protection he'd offered by simply being present, making it clear by his attention that she wasn't unclaimed territory for other men to pursue. In the end, she decided that a man who lived alone in the mountains for 8 years had to be capable of violence. The wilderness didn't forgive weakness, but that didn't make him a bad man. It just made him a survivor, and Rebecca understood survivors. He came to the store on Wednesday, then again on Friday. Each time he bought small things, items he clearly didn't need, but that gave him an excuse to see her and talk to her. If Mr. Griswold noticed the pattern, he didn't comment on it. Mrs. Griswold, however, made her disapproval increasingly clear. "You're going to get yourself ruined," she hissed at Rebecca on Friday afternoon after Orion had left. "A mountain man like that doesn't want a wife. He wants something else. And once he's had it, he'll disappear back into his hills and leave you with nothing but shame." Rebecca set down the can of beans she'd been shelving with enough force to make Mrs. Griswold flinch. "Mrs. Griswold, with all due respect, you don't know anything about Mr. Luther's intentions, and you don't know anything about mine." "I know what I see. I see a girl who's too proud for her own good, making eyes at a man who's barely civilized." "That's enough." Rebecca's voice cracked like a whip. "I'm grateful for this job, and I'll work hard every day I'm here, but my personal life is my own business. If you have a problem with that, you can discuss it with Mr. Griswold." She walked into the back room before Mrs. Griswold could respond, her hands shaking with anger and adrenaline. She'd never spoken to an employer that way before, never dared to stand up for herself so directly. But something about Orion, about the way he believed in her, made her feel stronger. Sunday came again, and this time Orion suggested a walk instead of another meal at the hotel. They followed the road out of town toward the hills, not going far but far enough that the noise of Grass Valley faded behind them. The October air was crisp and clean, and the leaves on the oaks were just starting to turn gold. "Mrs. Griswold has been giving me trouble," Rebecca said as they walked. "About you." "Want me to stop coming around?" He asked it seriously, like he would if she said yes. "No, I told her it was none of her business." Rebecca glanced at him. "But she said you killed 2 men. Orion's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "That's true. 6 years ago. They tried to steal my winter catch, about 8 months' worth of furs. I caught them loading up my pelts onto their horses. I told them to put everything back and leave. They drew on me instead." He paused. "I was faster. Do you regret it?" "Regret that they made the choices they did, yeah. Regret defending what was mine, what I'd worked for." "No." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "I'm not a violent man by nature, Rebecca Jane, but I won't be stolen from, and I won't let anyone hurt what's mine. Does that scare you?" She thought about it honestly. "No, I think it makes you human, and I think any woman would be lucky to have a man who would protect her that fiercely." Something in his expression shifted, became even more intense. "Is that what you are? Mine?" The question should have offended her. It should have made her bristle at the possessiveness, but instead, it made heat pool low in her belly and her pulse quicken. "I think I could be, if you mean it the right way." "I mean it every way," he said roughly. "I mean I want to court you properly and marry you as soon as you'll have me. I mean I want to take you up to my cabin and show you the life we could build together. I mean I want to fall asleep next to you every night and wake up with you every morning for the rest of my life." "Orion," she breathed. "Too much?" He searched her face anxiously. "Tell me if it's too much, I'll slow down." "It's terrifying," she admitted. "We've known each other 3 weeks. This is insane." "I know. But I want it too. I want all of it." The words burst out of her like a confession. "I've never wanted anything as much as I want this, want you." He closed the distance between them in one long stride, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that belied his size and strength. "Rebecca Jane," he said, his voice low and reverent. "Can I kiss you?" "Yes," she whispered, and then his mouth was on hers. It was nothing like she'd imagined a kiss would be. It was soft and careful and achingly tender, his lips moving against hers like she was precious, like she was something sacred. His hands cradled her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones, and she reached up to grip his wrists just to steady herself because her knees had gone weak. When he finally pulled back, his gray eyes were molten. "I love you," he said simply. "I know it's too soon to say that, but it's true. I love you, Rebecca Jane Morris, and I'm going to marry you if you'll have me." "I love you too," she said, shocked to realize it was true. 3 weeks, and somehow this mountain man with his gentle hands and fierce protectiveness had become essential to her. Yes, I'll marry you." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and she melted into him, into his strength and warmth, and the promise of a future she'd never dared to imagine. They set the wedding for the first Saturday in November, which gave them exactly 4 weeks to prepare. It wasn't much time, but neither of them wanted to wait. Rebecca gave notice at the store, and surprisingly, Mr. Griswold wished her well. Mrs. Griswold said nothing, but her tight-lipped expression spoke volumes. Orion came to town 3 times a week now, no longer bothering with excuses about supplies. He helped Rebecca shop for the things she'd need for the cabin, practical items like warm clothes and sturdy boots and cookware that could withstand use over an open fire. He was patient with her questions about mountain life, honest about the difficulties she'd face. "Winters are hard," he told her seriously. "We'll be snowed in for months at a time. The nearest neighbor is 8 miles away. If you get cabin fever, there's nowhere to go until the thaws come, and I'm gone sometimes for days when I run my trap lines." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Rebecca said, "and I'm not afraid of quiet. I think I'd like it, actually. No more Mrs. Griswold telling me I'm not respectable. No more whispers everywhere I go. Just us in the mountains." "Just us," he agreed, and kissed her forehead. The minister agreed to perform the ceremony even though Rebecca hadn't been attending church regularly, mostly because Orion paid him double his usual fee. They would marry in the small church on the edge of town, with just a handful of witnesses. Rebecca had no family to invite, and Orion had no friends in Grass Valley beyond the shopkeepers he traded with. It would be a small affair, but that suited them both fine. The night before the wedding, Rebecca lay in her boarding house bed for the last time, too excited and nervous to sleep. Tomorrow her entire life would change. Tomorrow she would become Rebecca Jane Luther and leave Grass Valley behind for a cabin in the mountains. Tomorrow she would start a life with a man she'd known for barely more than a month. It was reckless and impulsive and completely unlike her usual cautious nature. She couldn't wait. The morning dawned clear and cold, the first real frost of autumn sparkling on the grass and rooftops. Rebecca dressed carefully in the new dress Orion had insisted on buying her, a beautiful deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes and fit her perfectly. She left her hair down, knowing he liked it that way, with just a few small braids woven through to keep it from her face. Mrs. Henderson helped her with her buttons, her expression softening slightly. "You're sure about this, child? It's not too late to change your mind." "I'm sure," Rebecca said firmly. "I've never been more sure of anything." The church was quiet when she arrived, just a few people scattered in the pews. The minister waited at the altar, his Bible open, his expression kind. And then Orion turned from where he'd been standing at the front, and the look on his face when he saw her made Rebecca's breath catch. He looked almost overwhelmed, like he couldn't quite believe she was real. He'd dressed in new clothes too, dark trousers and a white shirt under a brown vest, and someone had convinced him to trim his hair slightly, though it still brushed his collar. He was so handsome, it hurt to look at him, all rough edges and masculine strength barely contained in civilized clothing. Rebecca walked down the aisle alone because there was no one to give her away, but she didn't feel alone. She felt Orion's eyes on her every step, felt the weight of his love and certainty, and by the time she reached his side, she was smiling so hard her cheeks hurt. "You're beautiful," he whispered as she took her place beside him. "You're not so bad yourself," she whispered back, and he grinned. The ceremony was short and simple. The minister read the traditional words, and they repeated their vows in steady voices. When Orion slid the simple gold band onto her finger, his hand was shaking slightly, and Rebecca gripped his fingers tight to steady him. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the minister said. "You may kiss your bride." Orion cupped her face in both hands, his touch infinitely gentle, and kissed her with such tenderness that Rebecca felt tears slip down her cheeks. When they pulled apart, he brushed the tears away with his thumbs. "Don't cry, sweetheart." "I'm happy," she said through her tears. "I'm so happy, Orion." "Me too, Rebecca Jane, me too." They signed the marriage certificate, and just like that, it was official. Rebecca Jane Luther. She tested the name in her mind and found it fit perfectly. Orion had arranged for them to spend their wedding night at the hotel in the best room available before making the long journey to the cabin the next morning. It was a luxury, and one Rebecca knew they could barely afford, but Orion had insisted. "Want to do this right," he'd said. Want you to have one night where everything is soft and comfortable before we head into the mountains." Now, as the sun set and they climbed the stairs to their room, Rebecca felt nerves flutter in her stomach. She knew what happened between married people, had a general idea anyway, but the specifics were vague. Her mother had died before explaining such things, and she'd been too embarrassed to ask anyone else. Orion seemed to sense her nervousness. Once they were in the room with the door closed behind them, he took her hands gently. "We don't have to do anything tonight. We can just sleep if you'd rather." "I want to," she said honestly. "I'm just nervous. I don't really know what to expect." "I'll be gentle," he promised. "We'll go slow. And if you want to stop at any point, just say so. I won't be angry or disappointed. This is about both of us, not just me." His consideration made her love him even more. She reached up and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble under her fingertips. "I trust you." He kissed her softly, then deeper, and gradually the nervousness faded into something warmer and more urgent. His hands were careful as they undid the buttons of her dress, his movements slow enough to give her time to object if she wanted. But she didn't want to object. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted to fully become his wife in every sense of the word. The night was tender and occasionally awkward, as first times often are, but it was also beautiful. Orion kept his promise to be gentle, murmuring praise and endearments against her skin, telling her she was perfect, telling her he loved her. And afterward, as they lay tangled together in the soft hotel bed, Rebecca felt a peace she'd never known before. She felt safe. She felt cherished. She felt home. "Rebecca Jane Luther," Orion murmured against her hair. "My wife." "Say it again," she whispered. "Rebecca Jane." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "My Rebecca Jane." She fell asleep that night listening to him breathe, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her, and she didn't have a single regret. They left Grass Valley at dawn the next morning, all of Rebecca's belongings packed onto the sturdy mule Orion had brought down from the mountains. He had his own horse, a big gelding named Brutus, who was apparently as comfortable in steep terrain as a mountain goat. Rebecca would ride behind him until they reached the cabin. The journey took most of the day. They followed established roads at first, then trails that became progressively rougher and less defined. The elevation climbed steadily, and the air grew thinner and colder. But the scenery was spectacular. Pine forests rose on all sides, and in clearings they could see down into valleys painted gold and red with autumn color. Hawks circled overhead, and once they spotted a bear in the distance, though it paid them no attention. "You're not scared?" Orion asked, noting how calmly she watched the bear. "Should I be? You're here." He smiled at that, his arm tightening around her waist where she sat in front of him on the saddle. "That's right, I'm here. Nothing's going to hurt you, Rebecca Jane. Not while I'm alive." The cabin appeared around mid-afternoon, nestled in a clearing beside a swift-running creek, just as he'd described. It was small but solidly built, with a stone chimney and real glass windows that must have cost a fortune to haul up here. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Rebecca looked at Orion in surprise. "Built up the fire before I left yesterday morning," he explained. "Wanted it to be warm when I brought you home." Home. The word settled into her chest like a blessing. He helped her down from the horse, then unlocked the door and pushed it open. "Wait," he said, and before she could ask why, he'd scooped her up into his arms. "Orion!" she laughed, startled. "Carrying my bride over the threshold," he said firmly, and suited action to words, stepping into the cabin with her cradled against his chest. The interior was exactly as he'd described it, and yet somehow better. The single room was warm from the fire crackling in the stone fireplace. The furniture was rough but well made, clearly crafted by someone who cared about his work. A table and 2 chairs sat near the front window. A sturdy bed occupied one corner, piled with furs and wool blankets. Shelves held supplies and a few books. A ladder led up to a loft space. Everything was clean and well organized, the space of someone who lived alone and had made peace with his solitude. But now he wouldn't be alone anymore. Orion set her down carefully and watched her face as she looked around. "I know it's not much." "It's perfect," Rebecca interrupted. She turned to him smiling. "It's absolutely perfect, Orion. Show me everything." So he did. He showed her where he kept the food supplies, how to work the damper on the fireplace for the best heat, where the well was for drawing water. He showed her his furs and his traps, his tools and his small collection of books. He showed her the loft where he slept, though he said they'd probably use the bed downstairs since it was more comfortable for two people. He showed her the clearing where the deer came at dawn, and the path down to the creek where she could wash clothes or bathe in summer, though he warned the water was ice cold even in August. In winter we'll heat water in the big pot for bathing, he explained. It's more work, but it's better than freezing, and I'll chop ice from the creek for drinking water when it gets too cold to draw from the well. You've thought of everything, Rebecca said. Had to. Up here you die if you're not prepared. He took her hand. But I'll teach you everything I know. By spring, you'll be as comfortable in these mountains as I am. That first evening in the cabin, Rebecca cooked her first meal. As a married woman on the iron stove, Orion had hauled up in pieces and assembled himself. It was simple fare, beans and bacon and cornbread, but they ate it at the table by the window, watching the sun set behind the western peaks, and it tasted better than any fancy meal she'd ever had. After dinner, they sat together on the bed, her tucked into his side, watching the firelight dance across the walls. The silence of the mountains surrounded them, broken only by the crackle of flames and the distant sound of the creek. Are you happy? Orion asked softly. Rebecca tilted her head back to look at him. Happier than I ever imagined I could be. He smiled and kissed her forehead. Good, because I plan on spending the rest of my life making sure you stay that way. That night, after they made love again with more confidence and less nervousness than their wedding night, Rebecca lay in the darkness listening to Orion's breathing slow as he fell asleep. His arm was around her waist, holding her close even in sleep, and she felt utterly safe. Just before she drifted off, she heard him murmur her name. Rebecca Jane. It was soft as a breath, reverent as a prayer. He said it like her name was holy, like it was the most important word in his vocabulary. And Rebecca realized something that made her heart swell almost painfully in her chest. No man had ever whispered her name like that before. In San Francisco, she'd been ignored or objectified, reduced to girl or Miss Morris in cold, impersonal tones. Here, in this remote cabin with this mountain man who'd chosen her, she was Rebecca Jane, and he spoke her name like it was precious. She fell asleep smiling, and that night she dreamed of mountains and safety and coming home. The next weeks passed in a blur of learning and adaptation. Orion taught her how to read the weather by watching the sky and the behavior of animals. He taught her which plants were edible and which were poisonous, how to preserve food for winter, how to bank a fire so it would burn all night. She learned to manage the heavy iron pots, to make bread in the Dutch oven, to stretch their supplies because trips to town would become impossible once the heavy snows started. Rebecca discovered she loved the work. There was satisfaction in mastering skills that meant survival, in becoming capable and self-sufficient. She loved the rhythm of days marked by sunrise and sunset rather than clocks, by the changing needs of the seasons rather than arbitrary schedules. And she loved learning alongside Orion, seeing his pride when she succeeded at something difficult, feeling his patience when she struggled. But what surprised her most was the intimacy of living in such close quarters. In Grass Valley, even during their courtship, there had always been space between them, boundaries imposed by propriety and social expectations. Here, there were no such boundaries. They slept tangled together every night. They bathed in front of the fire when it was too cold to go to the creek, unself-conscious about nakedness. They made love whenever the mood struck them, sometimes with urgent passion and sometimes with lazy tenderness, and Rebecca marveled at how natural it all felt. And every night, whether she was awake or asleep, she heard him whisper her name, Rebecca Jane. Sometimes it was when he thought she was already dreaming, his voice soft in the darkness. Sometimes it was as they lay together after making love, his lips against her hair. Sometimes it was in the morning when he woke before her, and she'd surface from sleep to find him watching her with those gray eyes full of wonder, her name a benediction on his lips. Why do you do that? She asked him one night in late November, when the first real snow had started to fall outside and the cabin was warm and close around them. Do what? He was stroking her hair, his fingers gentle as they worked through the tangles. Say my name like that, like it's a prayer. He was quiet for a moment, his hand stilling. Because that's what it is. A prayer. A thanksgiving. Every time I say your name, I'm thanking God or fate or whatever brought you to Grass Valley and into my life. His arm tightened around her. I spent 8 years alone up here, Rebecca Jane. I thought I was content, but I wasn't living, not really. I was just existing, just passing time. And then I walked into that store and saw you, and everything changed. You changed everything. Rebecca's throat felt tight. You did the same for me. I was so lost before I met you, so scared and alone. And then there you were, this man who looked at me like I mattered, who made me feel safe for the first time in years. You do matter. You're the most important thing in the world to me. He tilted her face up to his. I'll probably say your name like a prayer every night for the rest of our lives, because that's how I feel about you. You're my prayer, answered Rebecca Jane. You're my miracle. She kissed him then, pouring all her love and gratitude into it, and they didn't talk anymore that night. December came, and with it, the serious snow. It started as a few flurries, and within a week had become a white blanket that covered everything, transforming the world into something magical and slightly alien. The cabin became their universe, with the mountains looming white and silent all around them. Orion had been right about the isolation. Some days the silence was so profound, it felt almost oppressive. But Rebecca found she didn't mind as much as she'd feared she might. She had books to read, mending to do, meals to prepare. And she had Orion, who told her stories about his years in the mountains, who taught her to play chess on the set he'd carved, who made her laugh with his dry observations about the squirrels that raided their food cache. They made love often during those snow-locked days, because there was nothing else to do and because the cold made them seek each other's warmth. Rebecca became comfortable with her body and with desire, learning what pleased her and what pleased him, and the intimacy they shared became as essential as breathing. One morning in mid-December, Rebecca woke to the sound of Orion moving around the cabin quietly, trying not to wake her. She lay still, watching through half-closed eyes as he built up the fire and put coffee on to boil. The early morning light coming through the windows turned his hair to dark bronze, and the muscles in his back and shoulders moved under his shirt as he worked. He was so beautiful, so unconsciously masculine and capable, and the sight of him made her heart clench with love. As if sensing her gaze, he turned and saw she was awake. His face softened immediately. "Morning, Rebecca Jane." "Good morning." She stretched, cat-like, and saw his eyes darken as the blanket slipped down. "You're going to be the death of me, woman," he said, but he was smiling as he came back to the bed and kissed her thoroughly. "How'd you sleep?" "Perfectly. I always do when you're holding me." He looked pleased by that. "Want some coffee?" "In a minute." She reached up and cupped his face, feeling the scratch of morning stubble under her palm. "I have something to tell you first." His expression became instantly concerned. "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Something's very right, actually." She took a deep breath. "I think I'm pregnant, Orion." He went absolutely still. "You think, are you sure?" "I'm 2 weeks late, and I'm never late. And I've been feeling sick in the mornings, though it passes quickly. I think our baby is going to arrive sometime in late summer." For a moment, he didn't react at all, and Rebecca felt a flutter of nervousness. But then a smile spread across his face, so wide and joyful that it transformed him completely. "A baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, even though the answer was obvious from his expression. "Happy?" He laughed, the sound bright and disbelieving. "Rebecca Jane, I'm more than happy. I'm terrified and amazed and so grateful I could cry." He pressed his forehead to hers. "A baby. Our baby." "Our baby," she agreed, and then he was kissing her, holding her carefully like she might break, and she could feel him trembling. When he finally pulled back, there were tears on his cheeks. "I'm going to be a father," he said, like he couldn't quite believe it. "I never thought I'd never let myself imagine." "Well, imagine it now," Rebecca said gently, "because in about 7 months there's going to be 3 of us in this cabin." He laughed again, joy and disbelief warring in his expression. Then he placed his hand very carefully on her still flat stomach, his palm warm through her nightgown. "Hello in there," he said softly. "I'm your papa, and I already love you more than I thought possible. Rebecca felt tears sting her own eyes. "You're going to be such a good father." "I'm going to try," he promised. "Going to love you both so hard, going to protect you with everything I have. You're my family now, Rebecca Jane. My whole world." The pregnancy progressed well through the winter. Rebecca had morning sickness for a few weeks, but Orion was endlessly patient, holding her hair back and bringing her weak tea and crackers until her stomach settled. As her belly began to swell, he became almost comically protective, insisting she rest more, refusing to let her carry heavy loads of wood or water. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she protested one day in February when he'd intercepted her attempt to haul water from the well. "Don't care, I'm not taking any chances with you or the baby." He set the bucket down and cupped her face. "Let me take care of you, Rebecca Jane, please." She softened, as she always did when he looked at her like that. "All right, but I'm not going to be idle. I can still cook and mend and do 100 other things." "I know. Just let me do the heavy work, that's all I'm asking." And every night he whispered her name like a prayer before he fell asleep, his hand resting gently on her growing belly, and Rebecca had never felt more loved or protected in her life. Spring came gradually to the mountains, the snow melting in patches to reveal brown earth and the first green shoots of new growth. Orion started running his trap lines again, which meant he was gone for a few days at a time, and Rebecca hated those absences. The cabin felt empty without him, and she worried constantly until he returned, even though she knew he was more than capable of taking care of himself. "I don't like leaving you either," he told her one evening in April as he prepared for another trip. "But I need to get the furs to market before the baby comes. We need the money for supplies, for things you and the baby will need." "I know. I just miss you when you're gone." He pulled her close, careful of her swollen belly. "I miss you too. Every minute I'm away, I'm thinking about you and wishing I was here instead. But I'll be back in 3 days, I promise, and I'll bring you something nice from town." "I don't need anything nice. I just need you to come home safe." "Always," he promised, and kissed her until she was breathless. He left at dawn the next morning, and Rebecca watched from the doorway until he disappeared into the trees. Then she went back inside and tried to keep herself busy with household tasks, fighting the hollow feeling in her chest. The first day passed uneventfully. The second day was the same. But on the third day, just as the sun was beginning to set and Rebecca was starting to watch for Orion's return, she heard horses approaching the cabin. Her first thought was that Orion had bought a new horse with his fur money. But then she heard men's voices, rough and unfamiliar, and her blood went cold. Orion always announced himself, calling out to let her know it was him. These men were making no such effort. Rebecca grabbed the rifle Orion had left loaded by the door and checked the window cautiously. 3 men were dismounting in the clearing, their clothes dirty and their faces hard. They had the look of drifters or worse, and she knew immediately that they meant trouble. She should have stayed inside and prayed they'd move on, but one of them spotted the smoke from the chimney and called out, "Hello in the cabin. We're looking for shelter for the night. Got any hospitality to spare?" Rebecca's mind raced. If she ignored them, they might try to force their way in. If she responded, they'd know she was alone. But if Orion came back and found them here, there would be violence. She made her decision. Opening the door, but staying behind its shelter with the rifle leveled, she called out, "My husband will be back any minute. You men should move along." The 3 men exchanged looks, and Rebecca saw calculation in their expressions. They didn't believe her, or they didn't care. "Now, that's not very friendly," one of them said, taking a step closer. He was tall and thin, with a scar running down his left cheek. "We've been riding all day. Just want a hot meal and a place to sleep. Surely you've got some Christian charity." "Not for men who ignore when they're told to move on," Rebecca said, keeping her voice steady, even though fear was crawling up her spine. "Leave now, and there won't be trouble." "Oh, I don't think you're in a position to be making demands," the scarred man said, and his companions laughed. "You're all alone up here, aren't you? No husband coming back? Just you and that rifle, and I'm betting you don't even know how to use it." Rebecca cocked the rifle, the metallic click loud in the clearing. "I know how to use it just fine. My husband taught me. Now get off our property." But they weren't listening anymore. The scarred man nodded to his companions, and they started to spread out, trying to flank the cabin. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs. She was a decent shot, but there were 3 of them, and she was 6 months pregnant. If they rushed her, she might take down one, but the others would be on her before she could reload. "Last warning," she called out, hating how her voice shook. "Leave now." The scarred man just grinned and reached for his gun. And then, like an answer to a prayer she hadn't had time to form, there was a roar from the tree line, and Orion exploded into the clearing. He must have been approaching quietly when he heard the confrontation. He must have assessed the situation in seconds, because he didn't hesitate, didn't call out a warning. He just launched himself at the nearest man with the fury of a bear protecting its den. The man went down hard, Orion's fist connecting with his jaw with a sickening crack. The second man tried to draw his gun, but Orion was already moving, closing the distance with terrifying speed. He grabbed the man's wrist and twisted, and there was a snap of breaking bone and a scream of pain. The scarred man finally got his gun out and fired, and Rebecca heard herself scream. But Orion had already moved, and the bullet tore through his shoulder instead of his chest. He didn't even slow down. He tackled the scarred man, and they went down in a tangle of limbs, rolling in the dirt. Rebecca couldn't shoot, couldn't risk hitting Orion. All she could do was watch in horror as the two men fought with brutal efficiency. Orion was bigger and stronger, fueled by rage and the need to protect, but the scarred man was experienced and vicious. He got a knife out and slashed at Orion's ribs, leaving a red line that immediately began to bleed. But then Orion got his hands around the man's throat, and it was over. The scarred man clawed at Orion's arms, his face turning purple, but Orion didn't let go. He squeezed and squeezed, his face a mask of cold fury, until the man went limp. The clearing fell silent except for Orion's harsh breathing. The scarred man was unconscious or dead. The man with the broken wrist was moaning and cradling his arm. The third man was out cold, his jaw hanging at a strange angle. Orion stood slowly, swaying slightly, blood streaming from his shoulder and ribs. His eyes found Rebecca, and the fury in them faded immediately, replaced by concern. "Rebecca Jane, are you hurt? Did they touch you?" "No, I'm fine, but you're bleeding. Orion, you're hurt." She set down the rifle with shaking hands and ran to him, or tried to. Her belly made her movements awkward, and he met her halfway, catching her before she could stumble. "I'm all right, just some cuts." But his face was pale under his tan, and she could see he was in pain. "Come inside. We need to stop the bleeding." She looked at the three men on the ground. "What about them?" Orion's expression went hard again. "They're not going to bother us anymore. The one I choked is still breathing, but barely. The others will live, but they won't be coming back once I throw them on their horses and send them on their way." "You need to let me tend you first," Rebecca insisted, "before you do anything else." He looked like he wanted to argue, but then he nodded. "All right, but I'm doing it quickly. I want them gone before dark." Inside the cabin, Rebecca made him sit while she heated water and gathered clean cloth. The bullet wound in his shoulder was bad, still bleeding steadily, and the knife wound across his ribs was deep. She worked as quickly as she could, cleaning the wounds and binding them tightly. Orion didn't make a sound the entire time, but she could see the muscles in his jaw jumping as he clenched his teeth against the pain. "You should have stayed hidden," Rebecca said, her voice shaking with delayed reaction. "They could have killed you." No chance I was staying hidden while 3 armed men threatened my wife," Orion said flatly. "They're lucky I didn't kill all of them." "You shot," she whispered, touching his shoulder carefully. "You threw yourself in front of a bullet." "Of course I did. That bullet was meant for you." He caught her hand and pressed it against his chest, over his heart. "I'll always put myself between you and danger, Rebecca Jane. Always. I'd take 1,000 bullets if it meant keeping you safe." She started crying then, all the fear and terror of the last half hour pouring out in shaking sobs. Orion pulled her carefully into his lap, mindful of her belly and his injuries, and held her while she cried. "It's all right now," he murmured against her hair. "It's over. You're safe. I've got you." "I was so scared," she choked out. "I thought they were going to hurt me, hurt the baby, and then I thought they were going to hurt you." "Nobody's going to hurt any of us. I won't allow it." He tilted her face up, his gray eyes fierce. "This is our home, Rebecca Jane, our sanctuary, and I will defend it and you with my life if I have to. Do you understand?" She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I understand. But don't you dare get yourself killed doing it. I need you. We need you." She placed his hand on her belly where the baby had started to kick regularly. His expression softened immediately, feeling the movement under his palm. "I'm not going anywhere, I promise. But I need to get rid of those men before it's fully dark. She wanted to protest, to insist he rest and let someone else handle it, but there was no one else. They were 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, and by the time they could get help, the men might have regrouped or tried again. So she nodded reluctantly and let him go. He made quick work of it, his movements efficient despite his injuries. He threw the unconscious, scarred man over his horse and tied him down. The other two he forced onto their mounts at gunpoint, their hands bound. He didn't say a word to them, just sent them riding down the mountain with a slap to the horses' flanks, and Rebecca hoped they'd have the sense to keep going and never come back. When he finally came back inside, his face was gray with pain and exhaustion. Rebecca helped him to the bed, made him drink some of the whiskey they kept for medicinal purposes, and checked his bandages again. The bleeding had mostly stopped, but the wounds would need to be watched carefully for infection. "You're staying in bed tomorrow," she said firmly. "No arguments." "Yes, madam," he agreed meekly, which told her how much pain he was actually in. That night, she held him carefully, trying not to jostle his injuries, and listened to him breathe. She thought about how close she'd come to losing him, and the thought made her chest tight with terror. He was everything to her, this mountain man who whispered her name like a prayer. Without him, she'd be lost. As if sensing her thoughts, he stirred and murmured, "Rebecca Jane." "I'm here," she whispered back. "I'm right here." "Love you," he mumbled, already half asleep from pain and exhaustion. "Love you so much. I love you too, more than anything." He recovered quickly, because he was young and strong and stubborn. Within a week, he was back to his normal routine, though Rebecca noticed he winced sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. The wounds healed cleanly, leaving scars that would be permanent reminders of the day he'd thrown himself between her and danger. May turned to June, and June to July. Rebecca grew larger and more uncomfortable as the baby pressed against her ribs and made sleeping difficult. Orion became even more protective, if that was possible, and she loved him for it, even as it sometimes frustrated her. "I'm going to town," he announced one morning in late July. "Need to stock up on supplies before the baby comes, and I want to see if the doctor can make the trip up here when it's time." "Dr. Morrison is 70 years old," Rebecca pointed out. "He's not going to make a 15-mile ride to deliver a baby." "Then I'll find someone who will. Maybe a midwife." Orion's jaw was set in that stubborn line she'd come to recognize. "I'm not going through this alone with no one to help if something goes wrong." "Women have been having babies without doctors for thousands of years," she said gently, but she could see the fear in his eyes and relented. "All right, see if you can find someone. But don't worry so much. I'm healthy and strong. Everything's going to be fine." He cupped her face in both hands. "You're my whole world, Rebecca Jane. You and this baby. If something happened to you, it won't," she interrupted firmly. "I promise. I'm going to have this baby and recover beautifully. And we're going to raise our child together in this cabin and be happy." "Promise?" he whispered. "I promise." He rode out the next morning, and Rebecca spent the day preparing. She was nesting, she realized, the instinct to make everything perfect for the baby's arrival, driving her to clean and organize, even though everything was already spotless. She washed the tiny clothes they'd made, soft cotton gowns that seemed impossibly small. She checked the cradle Orion had built from pine, running her hand over the smooth wood. She imagined what it would be like to hold their baby, to see Orion's face when he became a father, and the joy of it made her throat tight. She was folding blankets when the first pain hit, a tightening across her belly that made her gasp and drop the cloth. It passed after a moment, leaving her shaken. That couldn't have been a contraction. The baby wasn't due for another 3 weeks. But 20 minutes later, another pain came, stronger this time. And 20 minutes after that, another. The baby was coming, and Orion wasn't here. Rebecca tried not to panic. Women gave birth alone sometimes. She'd helped deliver babies back in San Francisco at the boarding house. She knew the basics. She could do this. But as the afternoon wore on and the pains came faster and stronger, fear started to creep in. Something felt wrong. The pains were too intense too quickly, and there was a sharp edge to them that frightened her. She tried walking, tried changing positions, tried everything she could think of, but nothing helped. By evening, she was crying with each contraction, curled on the bed and praying that Orion would come home. But the sun set, and the cabin grew dark, and she was still alone. She must have passed out at some point, because she woke to the sound of the door slamming open and boots on the floor. Then Orion was there, his face pale with terror as he took in the scene. "Rebecca Jane! God, what's happening? Why didn't you—" He cut himself off, clearly recognizing the uselessness of the question. "The baby's coming early." "Something's wrong," she gasped between contractions. "It hurts too much, too fast." His jaw tightened, but his hands were gentle as he examined her. "All right? It's all right. I've got you." He looked around the cabin, clearly thinking fast. "I couldn't find anyone to come, but I watched a horse foal once. Can't be that different, right?" Despite everything, she almost laughed. Not quite the same, but close enough. "Tell me what to do." So she did, between contractions that were coming almost constantly now. She told him to heat water, to get clean cloths, to wash his hands thoroughly. He moved with quick efficiency, and his calm helped settle her own panic. If Orion thought they could do this, then they could. The hours that followed were the longest of Rebecca's life. The pain was overwhelming, worse than anything she'd imagined, but Orion stayed with her through all of it, holding her hand, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement. "You're doing so well, Rebecca Jane. So strong. I'm so proud of you." "I can't do this," she sobbed at one point, exhausted and terrified. "Yes, you can. You're the strongest person I know. You can do anything." He pressed his forehead to hers. "I love you. I love you so much. Just hold on. We're almost there." When the baby finally came, just before dawn, it was with a rush that left Rebecca shaking and sobbing with relief. Orion caught the infant carefully, his hands steady despite the tears streaming down his face. "It's a boy," he said, wonder in his voice. "Rebecca Jane, we have a son." He cleaned the baby quickly and wrapped him in soft cloth, then placed him in Rebecca's arms. She looked down at the tiny red face, the dark hair plastered to his head, the miniature fingers that gripped her thumb with surprising strength, and felt love so powerful it hurt. "Hi, baby," she whispered. "Hi, sweetheart. We're your mama and papa, and we love you so much." Orion sat beside them on the bed, his arm around Rebecca, gazing at their son with an expression of absolute awe. "He's perfect. He's absolutely perfect." "What should we name him?" Rebecca asked. Orion thought for a moment. "How about James, after my grandfather? He was a good man." "James Luther," Rebecca said, testing it. "I like it. Hi, James. Welcome to the world." Baby James chose that moment to let out a lusty cry, and both his parents laughed through their tears. The days after James's birth passed in a blur of exhaustion and joy. Rebecca recovered well, though she was sore and tired for weeks. Orion was a natural father, patient and gentle with the baby, changing him and soothing him through crying jags with the same calm he'd shown during the birth. He talked to James constantly, telling him about the mountains and the animals, about his mother's bravery and beauty, about all the things they'd do together when he was older. And every night, Rebecca heard Orion whisper not just her name, but their son's name too. "Rebecca Jane, James, my family, my life." He said it like a prayer, like a thanksgiving, and Rebecca understood completely. They were his prayer answered, his miracle, just as he was theirs. August passed, then September. James grew rapidly, becoming more alert and responsive. His eyes, which had been dark blue at birth, gradually changed to the same gray as his father's, and Rebecca loved seeing Orion's features emerging in their son's face. One evening in early October, almost a year since they'd first met, Rebecca stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching Orion play with James in the clearing. The baby couldn't quite sit up yet, but Orion had propped him against a log and was making faces that elicited delighted giggles. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and rose, and the air smelled of pine and approaching winter. This was her life now. This cabin, these mountains, this man and their son. It was nothing like what she'd imagined when she'd fled San Francisco with her life in 2 carpet bags. It was better than anything she could have dreamed. Orion looked up and caught her watching, and the smile that spread across his face made her heart skip. "Come here," he called. She walked over and he pulled her down beside him, arranging them so she was tucked against his side, and James was in her lap. They sat like that, the 3 of them, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. "I love you," Orion said softly. both of you, more than I have words for." "We love you too," Rebecca said, then added with a smile, "though James's vocabulary is currently limited to crying and cooing, so you'll have to take my word for it." Orion laughed. "He'll be talking soon enough, and then we'll never get him to stop. Boys are like that." "How would you know? You're an only child." "Instinct," he said confidently, and she laughed. They went inside when the light faded, and Rebecca nursed James while Orion made dinner. It was such a domestic scene, so far from the violence and uncertainty of their first meeting, and yet it felt right. It felt like they'd been working toward this moment all along. That night, after James was asleep in his cradle and they were lying together in bed, Rebecca said, "Did you ever imagine this, when you were alone up here for all those years?" Orion was quiet for a moment. "No, I didn't let myself imagine it, because it hurt too much to want something I thought I'd never have. I figured I'd live and die alone in these mountains, and I'd made peace with that." He turned to face her in the darkness. "And then you walked into my life and changed everything. You gave me a reason to come down from the mountain. You gave me a home that's more than just walls and a roof. You gave me a family." "You gave me the same," Rebecca said softly. "I was so lost, Orion, so scared and alone. And you saw me, really saw me, not just as something to be used or pitied. You made me feel valuable and strong. You are valuable. You are strong." He pulled her closer. "You're everything, Rebecca Jane." There was her name again, whispered in the darkness like a prayer. And Rebecca thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, brittle and frightened and trying desperately to survive. That woman had admitted to no one that no man had ever spoken her name with love, had never whispered it like it mattered. But this mountain man, this strong, gentle, fiercely protective man, whispered her name like a prayer every night. He made her feel cherished and seen and loved in a way she'd never imagined possible. "Say it again," she whispered, just as she had on their wedding night. "Rebecca Jane," he murmured against her hair. "My Rebecca Jane, my wife, my love, my life." And in the cradle beside their bed, baby James made a small sound in his sleep, and both his parents smiled in the darkness. The years passed quickly after that first year. They fell into a rhythm that suited them both, the seasons marking their lives more than any calendar. They had a daughter 2 years after James, a girl with her mother's dark hair and stubborn spirit. They named her Sarah, and Orion was just as besotted with his daughter as he'd been with his son. When James was 5 and Sarah was 3, they had another son, a big baby they named Thomas, who had his father's size and temperament. Orion built additions onto the cabin as their family grew, adding rooms and a larger fireplace, making the space expand to accommodate their growing brood. Rebecca taught the children to read and write, using her mother's old Bible and the books Orion brought from town. Orion taught them about the mountains, taking them on carefully supervised expeditions to teach them tracking and survival skills. James proved to be a natural outdoorsman, already begging to run the trap lines with his father by the time he was 7. Sarah was more interested in plants and animals, learning to identify which herbs could be used for medicine. Thomas was still too young for serious teaching, but he followed his older siblings everywhere with determined toddler steps. The cabin was no longer quiet. It was filled with the sounds of children laughing and arguing and playing, with the clatter of dishes and the crackle of the fire and the constant hum of family life. Some days, Rebecca was so exhausted she could barely stand, but she wouldn't have traded it for anything. And through it all, through the chaos and joy and occasional frustration of raising 3 children in a remote cabin, Orion remained her constant. He was an involved father, patient with the children's endless questions, playful and affectionate. But he always made time for Rebecca, always made sure she knew she was still the center of his world. Every night, after the children were asleep, he'd pull her close and whisper her name, Rebecca Jane. It never stopped making her heart skip. Even after 10 years of marriage, after 3 children and countless struggles and triumphs, the way he said her name still made her feel like the most precious thing in his world. "Why do you still do that?" she asked him one night when the children were finally asleep after a particularly chaotic day. "After all these years, you still say my name like it's the first time." "Because it means the same thing it did 10 years ago," he said simply. It's still a prayer, still a thanksgiving. Every day I wake up with you beside me, I'm grateful. Every night I get to hold you, I thank God or fate or whatever that you're mine. He cupped her face in his hands. And I'll keep saying your name like a prayer every night for the rest of our lives, Rebecca Jane Luther, because that's what you are to me. My prayer answered. She kissed him then, long and deep, and when they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling. I love you, she said. So much it still scares me sometimes. I love you too. Always have from the moment I first saw you. He pulled her closer. Remember that day? You were restocking shelves in Griswold's store, and you turned and looked at me, and I knew, just knew you were going to be important to me. I felt it too. Thought I was going crazy. She laughed softly. Mrs. Griswold tried so hard to warn me away from you. Good thing you didn't listen. Best decision I ever made. They lay together in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of their children breathing in the next room, and Rebecca thought about the life they'd built together. It wasn't an easy life. Winters were still hard, and money was often tight. There were days when the isolation wore on her, when she missed having other women to talk to, missed the conveniences of town. There had been scares, too, illnesses that had terrified them both, a winter when the food ran low and they'd had to ration carefully. But there had also been so much joy. First words and first steps, the children's laughter echoing through the clearing, quiet mornings with Orion, watching the sun rise over the mountains, the pride in her children's eyes when they mastered a new skill, the way Orion still looked at her like she hung the moon, even after a decade of marriage. This was her life, and it was good. The children grew, and the years continued to pass. James proved to be as capable in the mountains as his father, and by the time he was 15, he was running trap lines on his own and bringing in good money for the family. Sarah developed a reputation in Grass Valley as a skilled herbalist, people seeking her out for remedies and medicines. Thomas, at 10 years old, was showing signs of being the scholar of the family, always with his nose in a book when he wasn't helping with chores. Orion's hair had started to gray at the temples, though he was still as strong and capable as ever. Rebecca had a few more lines around her eyes, and her hands were rough from years of hard work. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the young people who'd fallen in love in Griswold's general store. One evening in late summer, when James was 17 and making noises about building his own cabin nearby, when Sarah was 15 and beautiful and attracting attention from young men in town, when Thomas was 12 and growing like a weed, Rebecca and Orion stood together on the porch watching the sunset. "We did good," Orion said, his arm around her waist. "Look at them, 3 strong, capable, kind children. We did real good, Rebecca Jane." "We did," she agreed, leaning into his warmth. "They're going to be fine, all of them. James will build his cabin next spring. He's already picked out the spot." Orion sounded wistful. "Hard to believe he's old enough for that. Sarah will probably marry within the next year or 2. That Taylor boy from town has been sniffing around. Don't remind me, I'm not ready to give her away yet," Rebecca smiled. "You'll never be ready. But she'll need to make her own life eventually." "I know," he sighed. "At least, Thomas seems content to stick around a while longer. He's talking about maybe going to school in Sacramento, becoming a teacher." Orion was quiet for a moment. "He'd be good at that. He's got your patience and your way with explaining things." He paused. "This place is going to feel empty when they're all gone." "It'll just be us again," Rebecca said, "like it was in the beginning." He pulled her around to face him, his gray eyes serious. "That all right with you? Just being stuck with me again?" She reached up and touched his face, feeling the familiar planes and angles, the roughness of his beard. "Orion Luther, I married you because I wanted to spend my life with you. The children were a blessing, the greatest gift, but they were never the reason I loved you. That was always just you." His expression softened. "Rebecca Jane," he murmured. There it was, her name spoken like a prayer. "How did I get so lucky?" "We both got lucky. We found each other when we needed it most, and we built something beautiful together." He kissed her then, sweet and lingering, and when they pulled apart, the sunset had painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make us some coffee and we can sit by the fire like we used to before the children came along." I'd like that. They went inside their cabin, the home they'd built together, and sat by the fireplace drinking coffee and talking quietly. And that night, like every night for the past 17 years, Orion whispered her name in the darkness like a prayer. Rebecca Jane. And Rebecca, lying beside the man who'd given her everything, who'd taught her what it meant to be truly loved, whispered back, "I'm here. I'm always here." Because that was the truth. She was his and he was hers, and they'd built a life and a family in these mountains that would outlast them both. Their love story had started in a general store in Grass Valley, two lonely people finding each other against all odds, and it would end only when one of them drew their last breath. But that was many years in the future. For now, they had each other, their children, their mountains, and a love that had weathered every storm and grown stronger with each passing year. And every single night, Orion Luther whispered his wife's name like a prayer, because that's exactly what she was to him. His prayer answered, his miracle, his Rebecca Jane, the end.